Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Beyond Binary Thinking, your chance to break beyond.
The principle of this podcast is simple. We maintain that anytime someone has trapped their thinking into a false dichotomy, such as left versus right, us versus them, good versus evil, then you're oversimplifying and you're preventing dialogue by limiting what could be a rich conversation to the equivalent of a mudslinging contest.
Now, our aim is to offend anyone that's holding entrenched views and air out some echo chambers. We want to see if we can tackle some standard controversies with a little bit of a different perspective.
Previously on Beyond Binary.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone who listened to our last episode about atheism and Christianity. We've had a lot of comments and feedback, and we hope you enjoyed it. We've also now got a Facebook page at /Beyond Binary Thinking.
Yeah, I really loved getting the feedback. I think it was fair, it was interesting, and a lot of the people we were talking to would have been awesome guests to join us in their own right. I love how we opened up a dialogue, and I hope we keep that same positive and open conversation going as we discuss more and more controversial views. A lot of the feedback was entirely fair. I think we were quite generous and forgiving in our interpretation of the broad spectrum of religious believers, but I'm not sure we offered the same generous and open-minded interpretation to our atheistic friends. I was hoping to point out some of the hypocrisy and judgmental nature of many atheists in defense of religious people, but I think it's unfair to tar all with the same brush. Some people were quite critical of my take on Richard Dawkins and claimed he was more agnostic than I gave him credit for, and that I misrepresented his position. Now, I don't know, guys. YouTube does show the most extreme take on anyone's views for entertainment purposes, but I've read The God Delusion, and his contempt for organized religion and the belief in a deity is pretty clear. And some people denied that they're atheists. They said that they don't have to be anything, just like a person that's not a fan of hockey doesn't have to defend their position as an hockeyist. But I think there's a more interesting discussion.
Yeah, I maintain as well that what he's trying to do, he paints religion in a very specific picture, his frame of mind, and then he rails against it. The funniest videos that I know on YouTube about Dawkins are the ones in which he's invited to do ayahuasca trips to see for himself and break through that experimental barrier, which is always declined so far.
I was going to say, what happened when he took the ayahuasca?
Yeah, he didn't. He didn't.
Mate, can you imagine being stuck in a room tripping your face off with Richard Dawkins next to you? That would be so unpleasant.
I would like to be in a room where he's tripping. That would be
What, just watching him have a trip?
Yeah, that'd be great. I want to make one quick comment about my general idea towards religion is not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and I think we got that point across in a quite an interesting way. And I wanted to reference one talk from TED by the philosopher Alan de Botton called Atheism 2.0. And in this TED talk, I don't want to spoil it too much, but he essentially offers an alternative version of atheism to the kind offered by Dawkins of like the very militant anti-theism or anti-religion. He looks at religion and says it's really effective because so many people are religious. How can we use some of these things how can we use these techniques to further people's education and open-mindedness and critical thinking? So I'd highly recommend his talk, Atheism 2.0, for any further watching on this topic.
Right, let's get on with episode 2 then, guys.
From Cordoba, I'm Finn.
From Amsterdam, I'm Marijn.
And from London, I'm Chris.
What entrenched views need digging up? Well, we're going to talk about education and standardisation, but what is education? What do you guys think it is? I've got a few ideas that I kind of optimistically think what education should be. For example, critical thinking is really important. Ideally, students should be able to analyse and critically think. They should be able to learn new things themselves. They should have like a foundation in core topics like math, science and language. A really key point is that education should foster an intrinsic motivation to learn. And then maybe the topic of this podcast we're going to look into in a bit more detail is to have a system where abilities of students can be discerned, i.e. we can tell who's good at what. What do you think about those ideals?
I would say those are incredibly idealistic, maybe not entirely realistic.
Shots fired.
Ideas about education. Yeah. I think, you're positioning it as part of the goals of education currently. I think the third point you made, provide a base in core areas, math, science, language. I think that's maybe the most important one. I see education down to a very low level, which is the level where students might not learn new skills for themselves or be motivated in intrinsic learning, is that it's just to make people into capable members of our society somehow. Give them a base, you need to calculate, you need to talk to people. And then on top of that base, teach them whatever we can to give them some point of some position in our cultural society.
Right, so that would be my first idea of creating learners who can adapt and learn new skills, because the education system can prescriptively teach facts and knowledge. But more important for me would be that, as you say, Moraine, these people or the students come out of the education system and are able to learn new things themselves that they can then apply to the real world.
I would say this counts for the entirety of the education system, but I think there's a difference between university, where this is very much enabled. Go out by yourself, go into the library, pick up new subject, learn about it yourself, create your own research strategies. But then you also have more labor-oriented education, very specific education, where you learn quite a bit during your education that then you bring into practice. And of course, while you're practicing it, you're also learning on the job. But this is all very, very practical kind of experience. Are you learning them to adapt and learn new skills themselves? I don't know, maybe a plumber, challenge a plumber to become maybe a translator and see if they can learn that skill for themselves with the education they had as a plumber.
Yeah.
Wonder if that's possible.
I mean, I think it is possible. I think good education has an underlying idea of trying to get people to think about things in a different way. So your example of a plumber would be, here are some pipes, here's a plumbing problem. How do you solve that problem? How do you get beyond it? And then that way of thinking is really the goal of education.
Beyond the binary plumbing.
Right.
So you're saying there's less of a difference between practical problems and more theoretical problems?
I think there's a fundamental unity in those in the ideal of what people should be able to do at the end of it. At the end of the day, people should be able to look at a problem, solve a problem, break it down, whatever that problem is. I mean, it could be problem or issue or situation. No, so I think that's what unites them. But yeah, you're right that they're kind of different. In a sense.
Okay, well, look, I see where you're coming from, but let's take the plumber as an example, right? So perhaps if you really thought about it in a holistic sense and you learn all sorts from a different perspective, had a detailed comprehension, maybe you could come up with a new boiler or a more efficient way of plumbing a house, right? But in order to do that, you'd have to understand everything, like the engineering, the physics, the chemistry, the methods of product design, entrepreneurial and innovation ability, right? And to get that depth, you're going to need a lot of specialization. So Moraine's point stands, right? How is a good plumber a good translator? Right? It's easy to say fundamentals are transferable, but there are fundamental differences, right? And learning something to that depth means you've specialized quite a lot. And at what age do you do that? And I feel it's like a bit predeterministic to say to a young child, right? All right, Billy, you're not so good at playing the violin. Put it down. Time to pick up a wrench.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think personally, I've had that experience where I didn't really know what I wanted to do and ended up falling into philosophy, but turning out to be really happy with it. But even at 17, I felt like it was too early to decide what I wanted to specialize in potentially for the rest of my life. I mean, what do you think, that 17 is a good age, or 16?
They've been making it earlier here. For me, it was 16. It used to be 18. You would be in Holland, you would be able to choose quite freely from subjects until your graduation at 18, in my case, which is pre-university education. You need 6 years until you're 18. And then they changed it into a 4-group system, which I had to choose at 16. 2 groups. One group is nature sciences and the other group is more social-oriented sciences. Then the nature sciences falls out into heavy maths or heavy biology. And the social one falls out into economy-related or more language-related. And so in those 4 groups, you're choosing at age 15 already which path you want to take, which I've always felt was way too early and way too restrictive. I took the math path myself and then ended up studying philosophy and anthropology. So At 15, I had no idea.
Yeah, so that was going to be my question. Is it easy to change topic over to a different area? And does that necessarily prevent you from going on to study higher education, for example, in a different area?
Partially, yeah, for sure. If at 15 you weren't realizing you wanted to become a doctor, which you need biology for, and you would have done an economy profile, you would have had to, I mean, you can do the biology after graduation. There are schools where you can just get just a biology certification. So it's not locked out for the rest of your life, but I feel it's quite early to give students, for students to pick a path already. And compare it to maybe America, where even in university during the first year, you're still fairly free to take on subjects from any kind of discipline.
Yeah, not even free though, right? Like they have to. Mm-hmm. So in the American system, a bachelor's is typically 4 years and they learn maths, history, computing and all sorts in their first year. And it seems to be almost like this catch-up extension of high school to me.
Mm-hmm. Not sure that works better, but I feel here in Holland it's quite early to make a choice.
Yeah, but there's pros of specialisation though, isn't there? Like, so would you actually want a doctor that studied geography and then at 19 changed his mind and started learning biology? Like, I would rather have a doctor that knew his stuff and had had as much study as possible, surely.
I'm not sure. I don't know. Why not? There's some real interesting... I saw years ago a list of famous business people and at what age they decided to go into the field that they actually made their famous product or famous invention or famous book they wrote. And it's all quite late ages, right? Do people at 19 necessarily need to know for sure whether they want to be an archaeologist or a doctor?
Yeah, I'm not sure it matters too much, but I certainly think Chris has a point that some specialization has its advantages. People who know they want to be doctors and are really determined to become a doctor, I mean, there's no harm in letting them specialize, I think. There still has to be a general education.
Yeah, I think the problem isn't
15 or 16.
Specialization necessarily, but like standardization. So I'm fine with some kids at some schools focusing on STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, maths, and they focus heavily on that. And I know those kids will be perfect for, say, middle management of some engineering corporation. Fine, good for them. And then maybe some other school wants to have this holistic, interdisciplinary, broad approach, and they try a different way. And it wouldn't be interesting if you let a bunch of different schools try a bunch of different ways and just let the market or evolution take care of it and see what works. And you'll have a broad range of people joining society in the workforce, and we'll see who makes the next Einstein and who makes the next Richard Dawkins. I don't know.
What ages are we talking about? Is this 12 to 16 to 18?
Yeah, sure, whatever, man. Like, I think...
Because it's
an
interesting idea, right?
So say Silicon Valley wants to do it differently and you have a bunch of kids learning to code, or they're even going to enterprises and learning how to scale a business up, right? I think everyone should try something different. We see what works and we see what doesn't through trial and error. And it sucks for the kids that go down a dead end, but that's what life's about, right? You learn the hard way sometimes.
Yeah, but it's an interesting idea. Like, put some kids into STEM school and train them to be super smart children of the future. Problem is with that if you lack anthropology and history, you have very poor knowledge of the way the world works on many other levels, and you're still going to be a voting participant in our society.
Yeah, and I mean, even engineers have to learn how to work on a team, right? So they have to study something other than just math.
I mean, I'm a big proponent of more balanced, expansive education. Have specialization come quite late, but I can see why society endorses specialization, why economy adores specialization.
Yeah, but it's really tough though, right? Isn't it? For a kid, when you get a bad mark on a test at 11, you stuck up on some predetermined pass, right? And because you got that test result, then you're stuck and you're not going to a top tier school, which means you're not getting into a top tier university, which means you won't end up working for one of these big corporations.
So is that recent in England? Because that's the way it's always been here in Holland. I got tested at 11.
Yeah, so I think testing's getting earlier and earlier, right? And it's more and more stressful for kids. And I think they spend more and more time learning for tests. And I know a lot of teachers are really unhappy because they spend more and more time teaching kids how to take tests rather than the stuff they want to teach, which is, inspiring, imparting knowledge. And so more and more teachers are leaving the profession because it's not what they signed up for.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Chris. And that's one of the drawbacks of standardization, which is like taking a one size fits all or having a very prescriptive syllabus that ultimately ends up preparing students just for a particular test. And that's not necessarily the best way to give them a good basis in education. It's more like transfer content pedagogy, where the idea is that, well, the kids need to know this, this, and this. So you teach them that and they pass the test and they go to the next step, and it doesn't really have a global vision. You guys might be right that my view of education is somewhat idealistic, but I think it's good to have a goal to aim at. And one, going back to your point, Chris, about trying lots of different schools, when we talk about a standardised syllabus or curriculum, I think that this generally applies to public school systems, whereas in the UK, there are private schools and academies that don't have to follow the national curriculum. So you get schools like the Waldorf school. It's related to the idea of play, and that students can pick their own curriculum to some degree.
Rudolf Steiner was an Austrian philosopher and esotericist. So he did a lot with the esotericist Christian spirituality. And from that, a whole system of schools and education came about. Different schools, different philosophies within that, but it all sort of originated within this anthroposophy spiritualism from Rudolf Steiner. You also have the Jiddu Krishnamurti schools, very very famous as well from India.
Yeah, the goal of it is to develop a free, morally responsible education with a high emphasis on social competence. Mm-hmm. So it's the idea of creating a student who is well equipped to go out into the world and adapt to different situations. Yeah. And because most things we do involve social competence, working with other people and things like that, that's why they feel that that's a good element to focus on. So the other ideas are play and critical reasoning, and also artistic expression. So it's very common that kids in these schools will learn to play an instrument or do art or things like this.
Yeah, I had a lot of anthropologists in my university that came from these Rudolf Steiner type schools. So, because they also were taught anthropology on those schools, which is not common in normal high schools here in the Netherlands. So they do tend to go probably, I would say, I don't know the numbers, but I would guess they would go less often into STEM type education, more often into social language type of education.
Right, so it sounds like it's very liberal arts
Pretty
education.
liberal art education, yeah. It is also fairly similar to the current Swedish education, which is also a lot more free, a lot more approach to the individual, no grading, no standardized testing, or as limited as possible, teaching children in their own tempo, with their own interests. It's more enabling the individual to teach themselves, to become interested themselves, and motivate this intrinsic need for self-development, which has been pointed out in this, what I called fairly idealized goals of education, which I would definitely agree with would be my idealized goals of education also.
Yeah, but it does sound wonderful, but all a bit wishy-washy, right? Like the morally whole, gestalt, motivated student. I like all of those ideas, but if I'm sick and I'm seeing a doctor, I want him to have studied hard. And I want him to have passed a rigorous set of tests and gone through a selection process and been graded and passed the grade. So what subjects should be standardized and what subjects, in your opinion, should be tested?
But medicine is not a one solution fits all completely objective science either, right? Medicine in a lot of part depends on experience. But I mean, there's also a lot of medicine also undergoes paradigms of thinking. And the current Western paradigm of medicine is very much one based on warfare, attacking cells, defending cells, something you don't see in every medical system universally. Go to China, you'll see a system around energies, which Western medical science doesn't believe in, but I don't see an objective truth in medical science either. So what you want is this standardized, tested doctor for like pure truths based on which he can heal you. But the practical situations is that doctors don't know everything. Doctors may make mediocre decisions based on the standardized knowledge that they have.
And the cure for cancer might come from a more Asian thinking, right?
Could be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's perhaps another argument for adopting a variety of different approaches and seeing which one works. Perhaps the next Nobel Prize will come from the Swedish system, or you might even get an American student who goes through their weird system, their ridiculous over-testing that they have. Have you guys heard of the SATs, right? Have you heard of their system? Are you familiar with the SATs? They're American Standardized testing. Right?
No, what about?
Yeah, the SATs are just freaking ridiculous. So rather than teach or check for actual literary comprehension, you just have to swallow a freaking dictionary. Like, it's a bunch of tests designed to be easy to score by the older punch card computer systems. So what you do is you just end up with like 4 options out of hundreds and hundreds of questions. Like, what's the synonym for this word, right? And all you have to do is, you've just memorized the thesaurus, and so it's just easy to give everyone a standard score.
That's like the worst part, like the worst interpretation of education, right? As you said, it's focused on how easy it is to process the quantitative testing.
Yeah, exactly. And seriously, this determines whether you get into a top tier Ivy League university in America or not. And when you look at it, it correlates so poorly with intelligence. It even correlates poorly with academic output. So all it does is judge your ability to memorize a thesaurus, right? And you're not learning from great literature. Like, they don't know what these words mean.
Yeah, Chris, that's a really good point. And I think this is one of the cons of standardization of assessment, is that high quality assessment in a standardized way is expensive and time consuming. So it's actually cheaper and easier to implement methods such as the SATs example or multiple choice that have inherent flaws and aren't as accurate because of constraints of time and cost, basically. And then this can lead to the idea that the test results are more important than authentic learning. It forces education to look at analysing test results rather than doing authentic learning.
So how about looking at it from a teacher's perspective? I think what standardized testing is us being scared that teachers do not teach well enough. Because if we would have full trust in the teacher's capability to educate our children, and we would know that they would do it to a proper level based on the individual, why would we even need standardized testing? The teacher's there every day. The teacher will know how far along are they language-wise, how far along math-wise are they. We're not believing the teacher's ability to assess. What we want is standardized testing to assess what is it irregardless of the teacher and his opinion, his or her opinion.
I think it's an interesting point, but I think if you apply that same analogy to doctors and you said, well, we should just trust doctors and therefore there should be no medical oversight, I think people would reject that. I think they would say, well, you still got to have a system in place to ensure that the doctors are doing their job properly, or in the context of education, that the teachers are, because there are bad teachers. I think we've all probably had a bad teacher, and the idea of standardization ensures that those teachers are at least doing their job to some degree, that it's consistent. And the one really interesting pro of standardized assessment is that you can use it to improve a syllabus or curriculum, how you can adjust it and make it more effective.
Yeah, okay, but I think it's quite telling what you just said, right? And I don't think you're wrong. I just think it's a fair assessment of how educators are treated. So there's this group of people just checking for failure, right? Whereas I didn't hear you say what we'd all want from a good management system, right? What's the system that helps teachers that are struggling, right? See, anyone can test and see who fails, and some will fail and some can handle the pressure and some won't, and some will just quit and they'll just go to a job that doesn't have a department that's constantly checking for failure.
I think it's very difficult to find a job where there is no constant evaluation, self-evaluation, feedback.
Yeah, okay, but more than just evaluation, right? Wouldn't teachers need support and training and guidance?
I totally agree. There's a management technique that's far more effective. And I think that's maybe what a lot of teachers lack, that judging by anecdotal evidence from teachers that we know who have quit various public systems for various reasons. But I totally agree. And I think that is a point of standardized assessment, is you can use that to improve this and support the teachers in their work. But then on the other hand, it can also, as we said before, it can incentivize just a certain test-based way of teaching and take away that authenticity and that creativity from the teacher.
We're not analyzing the teacher's capability, we're analyzing the students' capabilities, the children, right?
I think it can be used for both, as Chris's point was. I think it can be used to measure children or students in general, learners, but it can also have an effect on how teachers are monitored. Is that what you were saying, Chris?
Well, I mean, I wish it could. So I know schools get a rating, and I know the teachers get scored as well. So
I'd rather just teachers get scored, but maybe that's just me. I get the need to assess children and put them into other schools a little bit as well. I don't know, I'm a big fan of the Swedish education where they don't assess, where there is much more faith in, let's go back to the medical doctor example, that a child in a class shows proficiency and interest in that, and the teacher will help guide that child to become a well-educated doctor, without the need to score it, except for maybe score the teacher's ability to handle this process. And there's always going to be bad and good teachers. Even in university, I can single out maybe 2 professors that have influenced my studies more than any of the other ones.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Marijn. I think this walled-off style of education, of personalised, individualised education, doesn't stop people from becoming doctors if it's done well. And I think your point stands that there's a range of ability among teachers. Like, some teachers are exceptional and very inspirational, phenomenally good and lead by example and inspire people to follow their passions or whatever it might be. And there are also really bad teachers. I mean, everyone can think of their worst teacher and their best teacher, right? So I think this idea of standardization, especially in the public school system, is to check that slightly.
Yeah, checks and balances.
Yeah, well, I think the key here is the public school system, right? Because at the end of the day, it's our taxes that are paying for it. So if I want to send my child to some strange private school, say Professor Xavier's Academy, where they learn to harness their mutant abilities, right? Well, that's my business because that's my child and that's my money. But when it's state funded, you understand why people want oversight of where their tax dollars going and they want to get bang for their buck.
I think that's a really important point, Chris. I think the fact that there is a public system and a private system allows people that freedom to decide. But when it comes to the government-funded state education systems in most countries, I believe that people want this level of standardization. They want checks and measures in place to ensure that they're getting a generally good quality of teaching and that it gives them the basis. Like we said, my third point earlier, about providing a basis in key core areas necessary for life. That's one of the most fundamental things about education, and standardization is perhaps a way of ensuring that that can be met in a public system. In a private system, in the UK, for example, it's not mandatory to study the national curriculum. So these schools are free to take a more liberal or non-standardized approach to education.
So I'm going to upset the fiscal conservatives here, but I think teachers should be paid a lot more. And I think they should be tested a lot less. And I think, honestly, you're going to get some good teachers and you're going to get some bad teachers, but you'll get feedback as you go along. We all knew, right, who our good teachers and who our bad teachers were.
I completely agree, Chris. I mean, I'm a teacher myself, so of course I think I should be paid more. That'd be lovely.
Loads of money.
Yeah, but I'm a bit different because I work in private sector, whereas I think state school systems, teachers are underpaid. I think they deserve more. I think they're highly regulated and tested, and I totally agree. I think it's a very demanding job. I think teachers do way more hours than they're contracted to.
Oh, God, yeah.
And all of these things can lead to boredom or especially burnout in teachers. And I think there are quite high rates of burnout in the education system, at least in the UK public education system. Marijn, what do you think about teachers and being paid more?
Yeah, so I think it comes down back again to a lack of trust in the teachers. If we would not need all these checks and balances, if we had the trust that our teachers will be inspiring enough, good enough to teach our children the best they can, because that's all we can require anyway. We can put all these systems of checks and balances in place, but it's not going to result in better education unless you get better teachers and better teaching. And professionals doing so are not the bureaucrats creating the syllabus and doing the checks and balances. The professionals that know how to teach and know how to better teach are the teachers themselves. So if we pay teachers better, if we educate teachers better, if we have more access to more and better teachers, then there wouldn't need to be any fear, there wouldn't need to be any lack of trust, there wouldn't need to be any checks and balances. And I think the Swedish very free system, very individually focused system would work very well.
I'm really inclined to agree with you, and I think it's a case of public funding. If there were more funds available for public schools, the salaries could go up.
I mean, I think it's quite telling if you compare it to how businesses talk about training and learning and development, because what they say is, what's the cost of training your employees? Well, it's quite expensive. But then if you compare it to the cost of not training your employees, that's very, very expensive. And I think we need to start thinking about our children on a national level, right? What is the cost of trying to educate a generation of children on the cheap? That will have a long-term effect on the economy. And if you look at the countries that have developed economically really rapidly, right? Education has been a key part of their approach. So for example, if you look at Singapore's economic success, it focused on education and getting that level up to a very high level for English, science, technology, maths, right? And it did that in stark contrast to many of its neighbours, where only the wealthy minority could afford an expensive private education.
But this is unhealthy also, Chris. China and Japan's education system is unhealthy also. The pressures existing in that system to perform and to perform better than all the other competition is quite high.
Yeah, there's a lot of students committing suicide, isn't there?
My friend who lives in South Korea and works there as a teacher. And South Korea is a country with a really, really high level of standardization. And it follows the example of China and Japan that you guys have mentioned, in that there's a huge pressure. There is the public system, and then there are also hackwons, I think I pronounced it correctly, where students go for 4 or 5 hours after school doing homework, extra language classes, studying musical instruments. So kids are being burned out, and what you said about high suicide rates is also true of this system in Korea. And the one main criticism that my friend had of it was that the actual outcome, if you consider that Koreans have studied from 15 to 20 years, they've been studying English. You would think with so many hours learning English, they would be very competent in English. But what he finds is actually the reverse is true. And they're very good at taking tests, but they're not able to use English in a pragmatic and useful way in the real world.
So yeah, that's definitely a good point against standardization. I don't know why it reminds me of the Elon Musk school that was in the news just 2 weeks ago. Elon Musk in his Tesla factory has a little tiny school, or SpaceX factory, for the children of Elon Musk and the children of a couple of other Tesla employees, of SpaceX employees. And it's just a small class, 20 children, very rich environment, of course, because all these people work for, in rocket science professions. And these 20 children are very practically educated. So everything they do is a practical cause. They design projects, they go out, they go visit other companies. So it's all, none of this is just standardized for a test like you mentioned for South Korea. No, they actually have to apply it, which is great if you do it on the level of 20 rich children. But it immediately reminded me that this is impossible to do on a worldwide scale. Because if every class would every day go out to other companies to have field trips, then basically every company in the world would just have children running around on field trips all the time, right? This is impossible. You can do it with 20 children from one school. You can't do it with all the children from all the schools in California, let alone the entire world.
Yeah, of course. You'd have kids bouncing off the wall everywhere you went. I think it's interesting. With technology now, you can have the best lecture possible on any subject, right? Beamed right into the classroom. But all that is someone wheeling a television in, and it's a poor substitute for someone that's in the room, interacting with the kids, seeing their reaction, understanding their needs, knowing what they've understood and adjusting accordingly, right?
That's a really important point, because I think one of the advantages of standardization of curriculum and syllabus is, why reinvent the wheel? Why get each teacher to come up with their own syllabus and curriculum time and time again when there are models that work really well? One example is the Khan Academy, right, which is based on a series of videos which are very well done. It's not maybe the perfect example, and it's not perfected as a system, but it takes both elements that you've just described. There's a clear, well-structured and made video that students watch at home to learn the material, and they still get the class time with the teacher, but on a more one-to-one basis. So the teacher can actually really adjust their teaching style and adapt to the level of the student, really help them to fill those holes in their knowledge. And this works really well for topics like maths, where it's really hard to progress to a higher level when there are holes in your basic knowledge. So I think there's maybe some happy medium between the two systems.
Yeah. That sounds like the best of two worlds, I would say. To have both a very individualized approach, because I think Chris makes a very good point. Teachers do need to contextualize everything. Teachers do need to reinvent the wheel every time. And why? Because you're not dealing with a single individual. You're not dealing with one standardized humanoid. You're dealing with different people with way different backgrounds and way different interests, way different ways of processing information in their brains. But there is indeed, nowadays, we have such a wealth of information, such a wealth of access. We could indeed take the videos of the best educators. I've learned myself quite a bit through YouTube, watching YouTube videos, ranging from an Alan Watts to some guy from somewhere doing this is the thing in 5 minutes with an animation, and they make it very clear, very concise. And to combine these two, that seems to me maybe the best of both worlds.
Yeah, so this idea is called the flipped classroom, and I believe that it's being trialed in the United States, and it's also been tried in some classes in other countries, and I think the success rate has been really high. There's also a whole software system that works behind the scenes that gives you it's like a tree. If you imagine a tree starting with, for example, in maths, single digit addition. Once you've done 10 questions correctly in a row, it lets you move on to double digit addition or another branch which starts the subtraction branch. So basically, once you've proved your competency, getting 10 questions in a row correct, you can move through the tree. And this allows the teachers also to view the exact weaknesses of each student, where they're stronger, where they're weaker, and therefore they can accordingly adapt that. The other strength is that it's almost standardized. It gives you the benefits of standardization in that you can really highly measure students. Parents get oversight into what their children are learning. Managers of teachers can see how the students are doing, and that could be used in theory, not just in the one class, but in a school, a district, or even a nation, or globally. You could get a global comparison of or fundamental basis for each student in that system.
Big Brother is testing you.
A little bit. It has a dangerous element to it.
This could be a criticism of that system.
Yeah, I think the technology is absolutely extraordinary, and it's going to revolutionize things more than we realize. So as remote working is getting more and more possible, parents have more and more time with their kids, and that gives them the opportunity to impart more and more knowledge. And so we joked earlier about kids bouncing off corporate offices, but they won't have to in order to understand how work is done, right? They'll be able to be at home more with their parents more. And yeah, this is really important. Parents being at home is a significant part of the equation, because if you look at how NGOs and the UN focus on improving societies and improving education, their main focus at the moment is on educating mothers. And the reason for that is because mothers are more likely to be home. So any investment that they do in those women's education is multiplied, right? Compared to a father that's rarely home. So just like flipping the classroom, right? You're going to have the ability for the whole family to be reunited again, right? At home or to go outside. And this will mean they'll have the opportunity to learn entrepreneurial possibilities. They'll be able to learn so much more from their family, traditional family values. And honestly, you just have so much more possibilities when the family is united again, thanks to technology.
I agree. I was going to bring up homeschooling after Finn explained about this type of schools. And I really think this would work towards that more remote type of schooling, more remote type of working for parents, remote type of schooling for children. At the same time, I would like to homeschool my child partially in ways because I feel like I have certain information to impart on my child. And these kind of computerized, centralized systems where it can be measured, I can help my child, maybe bring him to class here and there, both for the social reasons as well, to get some extra support on subjects I could not help with, would make for a much more freer system, which at the same time being still checked by checks and balances to make sure that all children end up with the right amount of base knowledge.
I think homeschooling is a really interesting alternative if you feel that the public education system and the private academies don't fulfill your requirements of what you want your child to be educated in. For example, this Elon Musk Academy you mentioned is kind of homeschooling, but to a class of 20 within that particular context. What's the definition of that? How do you define appropriate education, and how do you monitor? How do you ensure that children are actually getting an education?
What is good curriculum? Because we've been saying invite the best. We were talking about these videos, have the best stat speakers, the best professors of all time. But there's always going to be a political, cultural element to education as well, right? Maybe the left wing wants to have left-wing professors, the right wing wants to have right-wing professors. There's not going to be agreement on what is best and what should be standard.
Don't you think, though, that with YouTube videos, professional educators, that you could just teach a range of different views and teach critical thinking, guide students to come to their own conclusion about what they believe is the best?
But I wanted to, you're saying about YouTube videos, very good example. Chris, you might remember a video you shared last week from Dave Rubin and the discussion that followed from that video. And you're admitting that you may have been following certain speakers and not really been able to detect certain falseness that they've been veiling within their conversations. And this might happen when you give children YouTube videos without the proper context and without the proper explanation and rebuttal, which a friend of yours very, very well did on that video, taking apart every point that Dave Rubin made and showing it what the problematic issues were with those points that he was making. And you don't always see it when you're watching the YouTube video. It sometimes comes so fast that you're not able to really dissect every point that they're making. And you might become influenced by falsehoods and stuff that has no base in truth and balanced thinking.
I do this podcast because I like to share controversial ideas. And I think sometimes people mistake me for right-wing when what I'm doing is a mixture of playing devil's advocate, and I'm also exploring other options and other ways of thinking I'm not familiar with that are quite interesting. But my main interest is I want to find out why the left keep losing elections, right? So that conversation you're referring to is interesting because Roger just wanted to deny it without watching the video I was sharing. He said, look, it's probably a standard right-wing argument. Here's my probable standard counter-argument. And you know what? Like, I didn't have to force him to watch an hour-long video, but at the same point, until he did, I wasn't prepared to listen to him because he hadn't listened to me. So, you're never going to persuade someone if you don't listen to them, right? YouTube or the comments section of YouTube is definitely not the place for people to get an education. And that's part of the problem with the platform at the moment, right? It's designed for attention and clickbait. So it'll try and hold your attention for the longest possible time, which is why the reason, let's say you watch a Jordan Peterson video, the next suggestion will be a Ben Shapiro video, and then it'll suggest Steven Crowder. And that's why you end up with Milo Yiannopoulos getting so well known so quickly, because the platform lends itself to controversy and sparking outrage. So I think if you had videos used on a platform that wasn't based on that trying to hack your attention span, but actually based on trying to show you good content that's educational and recommended, like more in the style of Reddit, right? I think you'd have a much better system, much more useful and for society. So guys, I've got something a little bit different for you now. It's an interview I had with a teacher. She's from the south of the United States of America. She wishes to remain anonymous for obvious reasons, but she touches on many of the points we've discussed today, and she brings a really unique perspective from the front lines. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Thank you. I've taught in both private and public schools here in the U.S. and abroad. So we have, at the highest level, we have a school board. So we have a state one that governs a specific area, and then we have the local or the city one. So the school board is always voted in by the taxpayers. And technically, as long as you are a citizen and a taxpayer, you have a vote on your local school board and within your state school board as well, even if you don't have kids. Here, everything is what you pay for. So everybody gets a voice in educating the local or society community children. And so as a community, you would be raising them technically together in theory. So in practice, what happens is it comes time for textbook renewals, which happen usually about every 8 to 10 years here. The teachers get a say originally, but then the parents and the school board get the ultimate vote on what textbooks are used in the classroom, because these are the textbooks their children are using. However, those are uneducated decisions most times. They pick the ones with the most recognizable authors or the ones with the prettiest pictures, and they don't look at the standards that those textbooks are supposed to be aligned with so that I can actually teach. I even taught at a school that in one of the chapters it said that God favored nuclear energy as the best form of alternative energy. Well, religion plays a large part in where I am, just because I'm from the South, and the South is a very big region of the U.S. that's very typically Christian based. And although those are two separate things here, religion and government funded programs of any kind, because that is the typical view of the people voting people into office, it a lot of times flows into schools. Why those textbook companies put that there, that's on them, but it's not unheard of because so many people here in the South that are very religious tend to favor the Republican Party, which is all for nuclear power. I can definitely see the link there, But that's just one example of how religion just flows into the classroom. It does so in the same like evolution chapters in biology. And it's even like in chemistry, the reason that apparently atoms are held together. And that's what the students will write on my test. Well, when I mark them incorrect, the parents will come back and say, well, it's still true. So I mark them incorrect, but then I get feedback from parents who go to my boss, and my boss comes to me and tells me that this child should be allowed to retake that assessment. This time, they're not allowed to put that answer, but essentially it gives the child another chance and more time to study the content so that they can get it right the next time. Just not on the same day as the original test. Yes, especially like in the evolution chapters, like I'm not in Kansas, but there are plenty of states that even if they haven't put multiple religions in their evolution chapters, they'll have parts that are withdrawn, or they'll have a sticker at the front of the book that says like something along the lines of, we recognize that evolution is not agreed on by everyone, and this could be potentially all false and is not representative of fact, but it's in this textbook. Essentially, it's a way to appease the parents by like telling the students essentially, the information we're teaching you may be false, so you don't necessarily have to learn it or listen to it. When it comes time for me to teach those controversial standards, I run into walls. Like on evolution, I would write an essay prompt and a child would write me a 2-page essay on how evolution doesn't even exist, so he can't answer the essay question. So how do I assess whether the student understands the standards I'm supposed to grade them on? If they refuse, I have to give them another chance, is always what happens. Sometimes what happens, the parents will come to me first and I will tell them no, and then they will go to my department chair, and my department chair sometimes supports me and they'll say no, and then they'll go to that person's boss and that person's boss, and eventually they will get to the school board, which they voted in. And here's where I say they use their vote as a weapon, because they say, okay, I voted you into office and I will not vote you into office next year if you do not support the views of the community. You know, X, Y, and Z, evolution doesn't exist. God's the reason the atoms are held together, and I'm sure there are plenty of stories all around of this. In reality, it's highly political and less democratic. Like, these parents are the ones that are voting these people into office, but they're not educating themselves on the facets of education. They might have gone through the system themselves only from a student point of view. So they never look at what it takes to educate their child. Like when we pick out textbooks, how it aligns to standards. What are even educational standards? Why do we have them? How do we assess them? None of those are taken into consideration by parents. So they don't make informed votes, which lead to uninformed lawmakers. Our school board is made up of mostly people who are not educated. And when I say mostly, as of right now, there's not a single educator or person who has worked in the education field on our entire school board. Where before, parents seem to have yielded less power somehow. I don't know if that's because lawmakers and those people that are voted actually stood up for the values rather than cater to every parent who wields a singular vote. To the parents that we have now, which are called snowplow parents. And snowplow parents remove any type of obstacle that is in their child's way. And sometimes those obstacles are things that we consider challenges that improve us or help us develop skills and help us be more efficient, but the parent sees as a potential for the child to fail. So instead they will be loud, or they'll go to a boss, or they'll wield their vote in such a way to remove the obstacle from the child's path. I would start my day with 50 or 60 emails from parents. In my first few years, I would start every single school day with 50 or 60 emails. I would have to dedicate an hour of my planning period to respond to parent emails, because I have so many children and so many parents, and so many of them had a problem. A lot of times there weren't real problems is the difficulty. It was my student's failing. What's wrong with your class? Why is my student failing? And a lot of times when they say fail, it means their kid has an 85 or an 87, essentially not an A. Actually, what I've noticed is those students that were homeschooled prior to high school actually come out tougher than those students who have gone through the system all 12 grades. Because they're more flexible and they're able to deal with challenges. The current school system, if a child fails at anything, whether that's a pop quiz or essay or a lab or any type of project or assignment, if they fail, they get another chance, and sometimes up to 3 or 4 chances. But the homeschool children, they see it as a challenge and they just succeed, and if they fail, they fail. They don't even try to go through the multiple attempts to let them pass because they see it as a true life test. We don't get to, in real life, in our jobs, just keep trying over and over. We get fired or consequences of some type. To prove to the parent, because they're so convinced their child knows the information and it was me that failed them, as if it's something I'm giving them, and then they finally get to see, like, oh, my child actually didn't know that content. But I have to prove it to them, but it's very difficult to do on every test or every assignment with 200 parents, where parents can now opt to place their child in classes that were not originally recommended to them, or that the child placed in based off of their grades in previous classes, like prerequisite courses, or in their standardized test scores. And I don't know where the stigma has come from, but there's a common stigma that the teachers just hate my child, and that's why the teacher didn't place my child in that class. However, as educators, there are children that are more lovable than others. I do see that. However, as teachers, we go by a separate set of standards. Our own personal beliefs don't play a factor. We look at the child's actual ability. So we really don't, we're not biased. What is the advantage of being biased? Because it's not like we will see the children again. They're going to a new level and a new teacher. Instead, it becomes actually more of a pain to us when they are misplaced. So like I am slotted to teach advanced placement, which is college level courses taught at a high school level. And I have parents who opt their child in to my course, even though they do not meet the prerequisites, they do not have the test scores, they didn't even do very well in the classes that they need as fundamentals for my course. And then I'm responsible for them if that child does not perform well in my course. My course is too hard if their child does not do well. So though my job itself cannot necessarily be threatened because we have contracts for teachers over here, if it becomes too political, especially for like small minor things teachers do in public, or even I think a teacher got fired for having a wine glass in one of her photos on Facebook. Like there can be those types of things that teachers are fired for. But instead, what we're doing is we're harassed and reprimanded, and people will come and assess our classrooms, or parents will request, like I had a parent request a weekly email on an update status of her child's ability in my class for just that one child, and I have 200 of them. And if there's no recognition that there is a problem, then the problem cannot potentially be solved. So really educating the public on the impacts of your decisions and the fact that a vote needs to be an educated vote need to be the next steps to even try to improve the current situation. The government course here in the United States that educate us on how our government functions is now limited to a singular semester. So every person, typically in high school, takes about 4 months of learning how our government is structured and how it functions. And then beyond that, no civic duty is impressed on people. They say young people are not voting these days because they do not feel the civic responsibility to vote. And I try not to have it come out as a complaint, but it's our daily life almost. It becomes almost laughable because we deal with these situations every day. And still, I will go to work, next week, and a parent will do something that goes even beyond what is currently happening. In the state of California, I was talking to teachers who teach out there. Lawyers are now being brought into parent-teacher conferences all the time. It's very common now. Have we really digressed to the point where we need to bring lawyers and the law into a meeting between a parent and a teacher to just talk about the student's progress in a class? It's almost like the parents want so much control over their kids' education, but then are not willing to educate themselves to better do that. And so instead, they just get angry when things don't go the way they would prefer, and they want to sue rather than actually fix the problem. There's no one that's going to make them, because they are the parent generation, they are the voters, this is the everyday man, and plenty of teachers are parents too. And I've seen teachers who are parents do the same things, which is, to me, horrific that you are the teacher receiving all of this from other parents, and yet you, as a parent, are willing to do it as well. I don't know in 10 years' time, because I don't know if our current education system is going to look like how it is. Clearly, it's not the same as it was 10 years ago, I'm terrified of what it's going to look like in the future, but I'm hoping, my hope is the next generation of parents become more educated. Whether that's going to be a reality or if they're all going to be the product of, say, fake news, we will see.
Well, we hope you enjoyed the interview and the episodes. Of course, we welcome any feedback or comments you have. Please post them on our Facebook group, and we'll discuss this as well at the beginning of next episode. We'll be back with episode number 3 on universal basic income in a month. And to end on a quote:
"Every act of communication is an act of tremendous courage in which we give ourselves over to 2 parallel possibilities. The possibility of planting into another mind a seed sprouted in ours and watching it blossom into a breathtaking flower of mutual understanding, and the possibility of being wholly misunderstood, reduced to a withering weed. Candor and clarity go a long way in fertilizing the soil, but in the end there is always a degree of unpredictability in the climate of communication. Even the warmest intention can be met with frost, yet something impels us to hold these possibilities in both hands and go on surrendering to the beauty and terror of conversation, that ancient and abiding human gift. And the most magical thing, the most sacred thing, is that whichever the outcome, we end up having transformed one another in this vulnerable making process of speaking and listening."
From London, I'm Chris.
From Cordoba, I'm Finn.
And from Amsterdam, it's Marijn.
Thanks, guys.